Now like to introduce Vince Pinneri of SPC Ardmona. Vince will approach this, I'm sure, from a slightly different perspective to our retail friends at Coles, but I suspect with similar objectives in mind, specifically in relation to our long-term national development and the opportunities available there. Vince, can I invite you now to share your insights with us?
Morning. I'd like to firstly thank the organisers for inviting myself and the other panellists to share our thoughts. Myself specifically regarding Coca-Cola Amatil and more specifically SPC Ardmona. I think there is little doubt that there is a great opportunity for the Australian food industry to benefit from the rising demand from Asia for higher valued processed and unprocessed food. This obviously stems from the higher incomes and population growth in the region, but we've known that for some time. The one key message I have for today is we will not be able to take the indolent attitude that the food markets of Asia are there for the taking and that we can easily capitalise on the opportunity. It would not just fall on our lap. Things will have to change significantly if we're going to be able to realise this once in a millennium opportunity. And this is not about being a doomsday prophet. It's actually to the contrary. It's about being positive and forward-looking, but pragmatic and commercially realistic. There are major hurdles to overcome in achieving our full export food potential. Success will need complementary action within companies and by governments. And to give you an example of that, I'll illustrate that by talking specifically about SPC Ardmona. Firstly, SPC Ardmona is part of one of the biggest sectors in the Australian manufacturing industry, as the whole food and beverage manufacturing is a $108 billion turnover and employing 300,000 people. It is 4 times the size of the much protected car industry. SPC Ardmona is the largest premium packaged fruit and vegetable company in Australia. We employ around 600 permanent employees and approximately 1,000 during the season. Of these employees, 80% of them are based in regional Victoria. Our parent company, Coca-Cola Amatil, is committed to food and beverage manufacturing in Australia, including regional Australia, using local produce and employing local people wherever possible. We have made a very strong commitment that we will be staying within the Goulburn Valley. We are committed to making this business work. We've backed that up historically with action in terms of productivity enhancements and innovation. And since 2005, we actually have invested more than $100 million in new technology and warehousing. And more is required to ensure that we have a competitive structure and a future portfolio of differentiated products and packages leveraging new technology. And I agree with the previous speaker that we need to focus initially first in the domestic market and then with a very strong focus on Asia. Nevertheless, there is much more that needs to be done, and like all our peers, we face a number of serious operating challenges, including and not limited to rising imports and costs. The significant strengthening of the Australian dollar particularly has altered the landscape dramatically for Australian manufacturers. It has impacted us directly through our SPC Ardmona brands, all but wiping out our export markets, which historically were in the range of 30 to 40% of our total business and are now down to about 5%. But most importantly, it has promoted an unforeseen flood of imported products that have undermined our business's capacity to invest and grow into the future. We also face an increasing regulatory burden which has promoted an increase in business costs. And we can't ignore the impact of the looming carbon tax, which will have the effect of raising costs up and down the supply chain in our sector. Prices will rise for locally produced Australian produce. Imports will have no carbon tax imposed on them, giving them yet an unfair advantage over local goods. In the longer term, if the Australian dollar remains high and without strong government and consumer support for local growers and food and beverage manufacturers, the survival of many parts of the Australian manufacturing industry, particularly the food industry, will be under serious threat. As a result of the increasingly serious conditions, we have undertaken a significant business transformation from August last year to improve our competitiveness, enable us to be fit to participate in the future opportunities. For our part, we are prepared to co-invest in our industry. We are willing to continue the investment in innovation and product development that has enabled us to get to this stage. However, as a prerequisite, better government policy must be developed and applied to guarantee a fair and level playing field for Australian manufacturers. This does not mean we are looking for protectionism, we're just looking for a level playing field in our domestic market. We believe that there are a number of measures the government must consider now when evaluating the future viability of Australia's food processing sector, both domestically and internationally. There are trade measures such as anti-dumping, countervailing duties and safeguards that are entirely WTO legal and which can and should be deployed promptly to tide Australian manufacturing over the present period of adjustment shock stemming from the high Australian dollar. We also need a modified tax regime which should include the abolition of state payroll tax, and for the manufacturing sector, particularly the food and beverage sector, more flexible labour arrangements, the restoration of reasonable levels of R&D, and more importantly, a further support for the encouragement of high education in food technology. This is going to be critical given our ageing workforce and the use of currently old processing technology. Because as we move to innovate and introduce new processing, the skills required are not there today to be able to accelerate the development. We also believe there should be a streamlined national system for labelling and product composition to ensure that the products manufactured anywhere in Australia can be sold legally, nationally, proper examination of the impact on costs, which will result from proposed further regulation of food and beverage labels, and an approach on necessary inclusions that is evidence-based and acknowledges the role that health and nutritional policy play. And equally importantly, a stricter control through customs to ensure compliance of imported products. Finally, we need an enlightened competition policy environment that will foster vital economies of scale in food processing and provide a confident basis for investment and competitiveness against now massive import competition from countries who often have heavily subsidised production sectors. Some of these measures are obviously easier to achieve than others, but are all important. SPC is committed to collaborating, similar to John and Coles, not only with the government, but also with unions, growers and retail customers as appropriate to ensure the survival and the growth of the competitive and viable food processing sector here in Australia. The current problem is an asymmetric problem. It must be addressed now. Governments and business now need to put in place substantive policies to stabilise the assets of Australian food industries, secure their future and provide a basis for confidence and expansion. Otherwise, the idea of Australia being the food bowl of Asia will have proved to be a cargo cult dream, and we will have lost an enormous opportunity for the food industry and for Australia as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Vince. You've certainly given us a lot to think about there, actually. I'd now like to introduce the Foundation's Chairman, Major General Michael Jeffery. If you could please share your perspective, and I know in particular a focus on the importance of nurturing our landscape, that would be great. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Adi. And it's really wonderful to have noted in the last 6 months the lifting of the debate on food security, and that people, including the whole of the country, I think, recognising that it's a big issue that has to be dealt with. I'm still not sure, though, that we recognise the true seriousness of the issue, or that we yet have the national plans in place to deal with it. Let me briefly summarise the global problem. Each of us on this planet, 7 billion of us, have about 1 hectare of land available to us. That's got to provide our food, our water, our energy, and every other resource that we require to live. By 2050, that'll be 1.5 people on that hectare of land, and many of them wanting higher standards of living, big cars, big houses, etc., etc. From a food perspective, we have a really serious issue. We've got to double our food production almost by 2050 on that hectare of land. But what's going to happen to that hectare? Well, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organisation is now saying that we've got about 50 to 70 years of topsoil life left for our global agricultural environment. 50 to 70 years. In terms of water availability, we're going to have critical issues because many of the food bowls of China, India, the Middle East, and even southwestern United States are drawing their water from underground aquifers that are only replaceable over hundreds of thousands of years. We're going to be suffering from the impacts of climate and temperature changes due primarily to devegetation of the landscape, and of course the costs of farmers using their current process of fertilisers and so on are going to go up, and I suspect that research and development capacities will reduce. In Australia, we've got about 60% of our agricultural land degraded. We've got 1 million kilometres of our streams and rivers no longer functioning properly. Why? Because they have been incised due to erosion. Why? Because we have drained the kidneys of our water systems, namely the wetlands. 80% of them have been drained. Why? Because many of our rivers and streams are no longer operating correctly or connected with the essential floodplains that drive the whole water soil system. But the other big question about water in this country is that of the 100% of rain that falls in any given year on the landscape, about 14 falls in the rivers, the dams and the roofs. That's what we look at. The other 86% falls on the landscape and we ignore it. What is happening to that 86% is that 50% of it is going up there in needless evaporation because it cannot filtrate the soil and be held in the soil as in-ground reservoirs where it should be. 50%. So patently, what have we got to do? We've got to do something about dealing with that big evaporation problem. But in terms of what's happening broadly further across the Australian landscape is that the average age of our farmers is now 58. We've probably got the lowest outputs from agricultural colleges and universities in our whole of our history, and of course we suffer the same high input costs for fuel, fertilisers, etc. So what are the answers? I think critically for the whole of the globe, not just Australia, we've got to actually look upon the management and the interlinkage of soil and water as a primary national, international foci, and particularly in retaining in this country the wasted water in our soil. If we can do this successfully and mix it with the insertion of carbon into the soil, which is essential if you want to hold the water in the soil, we could do that through a huge biodiversity of vegetation, whether it's crops, trees, woodlands, orange orchards and so on, but it's got to be a biodiverse mix and properly handled. If I was trying to deal at a national level with some fundamental philosophies of how we should move, I would be looking upon water and soil as our primary national natural strategic assets and managing them accordingly in an integrated way. I would be looking upon our farmers not just as the providers of our food, but as the primary carers of our landscape. And if I was looking at carbon savings, I'd be looking at the huge potential of agriculture to deal with the whole of our carbon emission, CO2 emission problem, both past, current and future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.